In the modern era, the prison is a centralized institution of the state. It is primarily designed for punitive sentencing and, theoretically, rehabilitation. It stands as a visible part of the legal system, governed by standardized regulations and the meticulous tracking of time. The jails of antiquity and the early Middle Ages were not built for long-term habitation. They were repurposed masonry, dry cisterns, and vertical shafts in the earth. For the commoner, a cell was merely a brief stop, a pause before the shadow of the gallows or the searing heat of the branding iron. But for the political elite, it was a tool of neutralization, a way to remove a rival from the board without the immediate blood feud triggered by an execution. Conditions in these sites were defined by the elements: open-air exposure, vermin infestations, waste-borne disease, and seasonal flooding. Inmates faced specialized cruelties, ranging from acoustic torture and total psychological isolation to confinement in cells designed to keep the human body in a permanent, agonizing crouch. Survival was a matter of logistics and luck. Let's explore 7 of the most infamous of these prisons from the past. In the city of Ghent in Belgium, the Gravensteen stands as a preserved example of 12th century military architecture. Built in 1180 by Philip of Alsace, the Count of Flanders, the castle was designed to consolidate power through intimidation. This intent is most evident in its subterranean pit dungeon. The dungeon is a specialized stone vault, accessible only through a small aperture in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered by rope into a windowless, lightless chamber with no lateral exit. This design created a condition of total sensory deprivation. The stone walls, several feet thick, dampened all external sound, leaving the occupant in an absolute silence, broken only by their own movements, or the muffled echoes of the legal proceedings taking place in the courtroom directly above. The logistics of survival in the Gravensteen pit were minimal. There was no integrated drainage or waste removal. The stone floor served as both a bed and a latrine, leading to rapid bacterial accumulation and skin infections. Because the room was below ground level and lacked ventilation, the air was perpetually cold and saturated with moisture, a condition that accelerated the onset of respiratory failure and jail fever. The primary horror of the Gravensteen was the psychological toll of its acoustic design. Visiting the fortress in 1837, the writer Victor Hugo descended into the keep to witness the bottle pits firsthand, describing the wretched state of those cast into its depths.
I have just seen the dungeons of the Gravensteen. They are terrifying. One is a deep, narrow pit, shaped like a bottle, where the prisoner was lowered through a hole in the ceiling and left in total darkness. The walls are slick with the seepage of the Lieve Canal, and the floor is a mire of cold mud. It is a stone tomb where the living are forgotten, a place where the dampness of the earth seems to slowly turn a man into the very stone that imprisons him.
The Gravensteen's bottle pit remained a site of active confinement until the late 18th century, when shifting legal philosophies across Europe began to favor structured incarceration over medieval holding pits. By the late 1700s, the castle's role as a prison effectively ended, replaced by more centralized houses of correction. In 1078, William the Conqueror commissioned the construction of the White Tower. It was a massive stone keep designed to loom over London as a physical manifestation of Norman dominance. While the upper halls were built for the king's court, the foundations were engineered for subjugation. Unlike the rural fortresses of the era, the tower was anchored directly into the marshy, unstable banks of the River Thames. This proximity to the water transformed the lowest levels into a perpetual mire. Because the basement sat below the river's high tide line, Brackish water and city waste constantly seeped through the porous masonry. For the Saxon rebels and rival lords held here, the environment was the first stage of their punishment. They lived in a permanent state of dampness and cold, standing in inches of freezing mud that never dried. The most calculated horror of the Norman period was the Little Ease. This was a specialized cell built into the massive thickness of the subcrypt walls, measuring a precise 4 feet by 4 feet. The dimensions were a deliberate experiment in human endurance. It was physically impossible for an adult to stand upright or to lie down. Inmates were forced into a permanent, agonizing crouch for days or weeks. This prolonged muscular contraction led to a horrific physiological breakdown. Tendons shortened, joints locked in place, and severe nerve compression often left survivors with permanent physical deformities. By the time a prisoner was removed from the Little Ease, their body had often conformed to the square dimensions of the cell, leaving them unable to walk or stand straight ever again. The calculated cruelty of the tower was best summarized by the ordeal of Alexander Bryant in 1581. Of this psychological and physical erasure, contemporary records recount,
"He was cast into that narrow, lightless pit for many days together. When at last he was brought forth to the light, his limbs were so cramped and his body so doubled up that he had lost the power to stand upright, his joints having locked in that agonizing crouch until he could neither walk nor find relief from the shape of the cell that held him."
This era of subterranean crushing eventually ended in the 17th century, as the tower transitioned into a symbolic fortress. By the 1800s, the Little Ease was abandoned in favor of Victorian industrial penitentiaries like Pentonville, which replaced physical deformity with the rigid psychological silence of the modern cell. While the Norman dungeons of London relied on dampness and geometry, the Chalke Prison in Constantinople utilized the horror of total sensory deprivation. Built in the 6th century AD by Emperor Justinian I, the Chalke was located within the foundations of the monumental Bronze Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the Great Palace of the Byzantine Empire. The brutality of the Chalke was tied to a specific Byzantine legal tradition: blinding. To avoid the religious stigma of public execution, the empire neutralized political rivals by destroying their sight with red-hot irons or boiling vinegar. These victims were then cast into the Chalke, a subterranean stone vault with no windows and virtually no ventilation. Because the prison was situated directly beneath the palace's most active thoroughfare, the inmates lived in a state of acoustic torment. They could hear the muffled celebrations of the court above them, while they rotted in absolute lightless filth. The lack of air circulation in the Mediterranean heat made the vault a breeding ground for respiratory failure and fungal infections. The historian Michael Sellos provided a full account of the psychological erasure of those held within, writing,
"He was thrust into a sunless place, a cavernous gloom where the light of the sun never penetrated. There, he who had lately sat upon a throne and was surrounded by the splendor of the court was left to lie in a squalid corner. The air was thick and foul, and the silence was broken only by the sound of his own laments. It was a change so sudden and so terrible that his mind could scarcely grasp the depths of his ruin. He was buried while yet breathing, a ghost within the very palace he once ruled."
The Chalke remained a symbol of imperial terror until the late 11th century. As the Great Palace was gradually abandoned for the more fortified Palace of Latomaie, the Chalke fell into disuse and was eventually backfilled. It was replaced by more remote fortress prisons, like the Tower of Animus, which utilized traditional masonry cells and high-altitude isolation, rather than the lightless foundation pits of the early Byzantine era. If the Tower of London utilized cold and damp, Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome utilized the opposite, stagnant, suffocating heat. Originally built as the Mausoleum of Hadrian in 135 AD, the structure was converted into a papal fortress and prison by the 10th century. The most feared cells within the Castel Sant'Angelo were the Sammalo dungeons. These were not traditional rooms, but were essentially narrow vertical chimneys, or converted air shafts built into the massive 20-foot-thick masonry of the ancient tomb. Prisoners were lowered into these tubes from above. The dimensions were so tight that movement was nearly impossible, and there was no lateral ventilation. During the Roman summers, these shafts became stone ovens. The lack of airflow, combined with the extreme humidity of the Tiber River nearby, meant that the air inside became a toxic, oxygen-deprived soup. Many prisoners died of heat stroke or suffocation long before their sentences were ever carried out. The celebrated Renaissance goldsmith and sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, who was imprisoned there in 1539, provided a harrowing account of the conditions. He described being thrown into a vile hole where the walls were covered in slimy, crawling creatures, and the air was so thick it was difficult to draw a breath. He wrote,
"I was placed in a cell where there was a great deal of water, and it was full of tarantulas and poisonous worms. They threw me a mattress of coarse hemp, which became soaked with water in 3 days. I remained in that dark hole, where I was unable to stand upright. The place was so dark that I could see nothing, and I was forced to crawl on my hands and knees in the mud. I felt the touch of those slimy, crawling creatures upon my face and hands, and the air was so foul that I thought my heart would stop from the stench."
The use of the Sammalo dungeons as cells began to decline in the late 17th century as the papacy modernized its judicial system. By the mid-19th century, the prison was largely decommissioned as Italy moved toward a unified national penal code. The horrific chimneys of the San Marocco were filled in or sealed off, turning the fortress into a museum of the very power it once enforced. While the other prisons on this list were often reserved for political enemies of the state, Newgate Prison in London was a for-profit death trap for the common soul. Established in 1188 inside the city's Roman wall, it was a place of predatory commerce. If a prisoner could not pay the garnish, a fee demanded by the jailers for everything from food to the removal of heavy iron shackles, they were cast into the Limbo. The Limbo was a subterranean ward located deep beneath the street level of the gatehouse. It was a lightless, airless cavern that sat in a permanent slurry of human waste and mud. Because the prison lacked any drainage, the floor was a literal sponge for the city's filth. The nastiness was not merely a lack of comfort, it was biological. The ward was the epicenter of jail fever, the medieval term for typhus. This was a nightmare of the senses. The air was so thick with the stench of rot and unwashed bodies that visitors were known to faint upon simply opening the door to the ward. The conditions turned the human body into a host for decay. William Smith, an 18th century doctor who visited the wards to document the hellish conditions, provided a visceral account of the state of the men held in the dark.
I beheld a sight that would freeze the blood. In the wards of Newgate, men were crowded together in a state of the most shocking filth. Their bodies were covered with vermin and sores, and their skin had taken on the leaden hue of the pestilence. The air was so corrupted and offensive that it was a wonder any could draw breath. I saw many who were unable to rise from the floor, which was covered in a mire of water and filth. The stench of the jail fever was so thick that it seemed to penetrate the very clothing, and I was forced to flee the place for fear of my own life.
Newgate's subterranean horrors continued for centuries, becoming so infamous that the great stink of the prison was said to reach the nearby Old Bailey courthouse, occasionally killing judges and jurors through the sheer spread of typhus. The original medieval gatehouse was finally demolished in 1767 and later rebuilt, but the systemic filth remained until the 19th century. By 1902, Newgate was finally closed and demolished, replaced by the modern Old Bailey, as the Victorian era sought to hide its greatest shame behind the clean stone facade of the new courthouse. The Mamertine Prison in Rome is perhaps the oldest and most well-preserved ancient chamber on this list. Built around 600 BC, it was not designed to hold people for years, but to break them in the days leading up to their death. The site consists of 2 stacked chambers, but the true hell on earth was the lower level, the Tullianum. Originally a circular stone cistern, the Tullianum was accessible only through a small hole in the ceiling. It was connected directly to the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's main sewer. This meant the cell was perpetually cold, lightless, and filled with a thick, humid vapor of raw sewage. Prisoners were lowered by rope into this pit, where they sat in the pitch-black dampness, listening to the rushing waste of the city through the walls. The nastiness here was the speed of decay. In the oxygen-deprived, ammonia-heavy air, the human body struggled to function. Wounds from the battlefield or the arena would instantly become septic. The Roman historian Sallust, writing in the 1st century BC, left a hauntingly precise record of disgraced former consul Lentulus's time in the Tullianum, writing,
"In the prison, there is a place called the Tullianum, about 12 feet below the ground. It is enclosed on all sides by walls and covered by a vaulted roof of stone. But these are not joined by mortar. Rather, they are arched by the leaning of the stones upon one another. Its appearance is disgusting and horrible by reason of the filth, the darkness, and the foul smell. After Lentulus had been lowered into this place through a hole in the ceiling, the executioners, to whom orders had been given, strangled him with a noose."
The Mamertine functioned as Rome's primary death house for over 1,000 years, famously holding the Gallic leader Vercingetorix before his execution in 46 BC. Its use as a dungeon finally ceased in the 4th century AD, when it was consecrated as a Christian shrine. By the Middle Ages, the horrific cistern had been transformed into a place of pilgrimage, replacing the stench of the sewer with incense, though the original suffocating stone walls remain intact to this day. While other prisons relied on the weight of stone ceilings, the Latomaie, the ancient limestone quarries of Syracuse, turned the very earth into a massive roofless grave. After the failed Athenian expedition in 413 BC, over 7,000 soldiers were driven into these sheer walled pits. These were not cells. They were vertical scars in the landscape, over 100 feet deep, from which there was no escape. The worst parts of the Latomaie were the total exposure, the filth, and the high-density overcrowding. During the day, the white limestone walls acted as mirrors, reflecting the blistering Sicilian sun and raising temperatures to lethal levels. At night, the heat vanished, leaving the men to freeze in the damp autumn air. With no sanitation and no shelter, the floor of the quarry quickly became a slurry of mud, blood, and human waste. The primary horror, however, was the biological breakdown. Because the Syracusans refused to remove the bodies of those who died, the living were forced to exist, eat and sleep among thousands of rotting corpses. The historian Thucydides, who recorded the catastrophe, provided a devastating account of the physical and sensory collapse.
They were crowded in a narrow hole, without any roof to cover them. The heat of the sun and the stifling air tormented them by day, and then the nights came on autumnal and cold. As they had to do everything in the same place for want of room, the stench became intolerable. The bodies of those who died from their wounds or the change of temperature were left heaped one upon another. Hunger and thirst tormented them unceasingly. For about 70 days they lived in this wretchedness, until all except the Athenians and the Sicilian Greeks were sold into slavery.
The use of the Latomaie as a mass-holding pen ended after that singular catastrophic winter, as the Athenian threat was neutralized and the survivors were sold into forced labor. Over the centuries, the quarries were abandoned as sources of stone and eventually overgrown by vegetation. By the modern era, they had transformed into lush gardens, their horrific history buried under layers of earth and greenery. They stand now as a silent, sun-drenched monument to one of the most concentrated periods of human suffering in antiquity. When we look back at the hell on earth these sites represented, a common thread of calculated cruelty emerges. These were not merely places of detention, they were machines designed to dismantle the human form. It is easy to complain about the frustrations of the modern world, but a quick glance at history offers some much-needed perspective. Today, bad conditions might mean a flickering fluorescent light or a lack of high-speed Wi-Fi. In the eras we've explored, it meant standing knee-deep in a tidal river's slush while rats treated your shins like a buffet, where ancient jails functioned as living burials, using the crushing weight of stone and iron to physically break the body and spirit. Modern facilities have evolved into clinical environments of total surveillance, trading physical agony for the sterile isolation and relentless electronic gaze used to regulate the mind. If you enjoyed this exploration into the most brutal prisons of antiquity, and for more deep dives into the shadows of the past, subscribe to Echoes of Antiquity to stay updated whenever a new documentary is released. Thank you for watching.